Seems fitting to come to the campus of Ryerson University in Toronto, where they've been teaching journalism for a long time, to discuss journalism. A while back on iChannel, I did a program hosted by John Robson in which we discussed the 6 o'clock news, discussing TV news on TV. By the way, here's a great companion book, The Powers That Be by David Halberstam. It would take longer to read this than it would to watch this clip for Throwback Thursday.
Am I being unfair to the 6 o'clock news, or is it really a troubling place for people to get their information about the world?
I think you're being entirely fair. If there's one institution in society that isn't covered enough, it is the media. Because media people want to be relatively nice to other media people. It's just like it's hard to get a lawyer to really go after another lawyer, physician to testify another physician. So I think it's entirely fair to say, what should the product labeling be on the 6 o'clock news? What are the purposes that people are using the 6 o'clock news for? What role does it play in society? And is it playing an adequate role? Definitely.
Yeah, Big Statistics Canada says that of people in this country who follow current events, and most people either do or claim to, 91% get some of their information from TV news. It's ahead of any other source. Newspapers are at 70%. And bearing in mind, of course, that people don't always tell pollsters the truth. Sometimes they think, what would it sound good if I said? But that means that more than any other source is this once over, zip, no chance to go back and look at it.
Worse than that, though, there is the illusion on television that you're getting the straight goods. People think that a picture is reality. And what they forget is that pictures can be edited, they are selected. Editors and journalists pick and choose and contextualize, but the average viewer thinks that television news is much more the straight goods than radio or than the newspaper. So they feel that not only have they got the news, but they've got the complete, unbiased, unfiltered news, and they may well not.
One of the big problems with TV news, let us say you want to film in the West Bank. Well, you can film what Hamas wants you to film, or you can get your head blown off. And that tends to mean we can get some very dramatic footage, but only of a certain sort, coming out of large parts of the world. I don't think anybody was filming the protests against the Iranian president inside Iran. So,
yeah, you know, it's funny that you say that, because I was in Cyprus at the height of the forced peace there, where the two sides were anywhere between 1 yard and 8 miles apart, the Greek Cypriots and the Turkish Cypriots. And I remarked that when I was at my hotel room, there was an old rusty barrel, and there was some barbed wire and some broken 2x4s. And I said, gee, I could do every single report I wanted to from right here, because it has all the visual elements that you want. And you're nodding, because it would have been really cynical to do that. I did go out into the field, and I said, can we take a shot up there? Can we walk up that alley? No. Why not? Well, because they would shoot you. Oh, okay. So you can get hoodwinked when you're in the field covering something. You can be at the whim of the people guarding you, the military or the militia or whoever it is. And it's really a tough call about how to cover some of that stuff. But if I could go up to 20,000 feet just for a second, we're kind of saying, well, on the one hand, it's awful, and on the other hand, we're in a democracy and the 6 o'clock news can do what it wants to do. But you mentioned an election. We had historically high voter turnout in this country until now we're down to about 50% in the last election. Somebody is to blame. Something is wrong with our system if only 50% of the population wants to vote. Now in Europe, when I'm traveling in Europe and I grab half a dozen newspapers on the way into an airplane, I have half a dozen newspapers that are similar to the best quality we offer in North America. When I see television, I often see excellent television in Europe. The discourse, I think, is a little more elevated in Europe than it is in North America. If it is that TV news is to blame, and you might be the person to answer that question, I don't know, we have to do something about it. We can't drop down to 40% of the electorate choosing the government, because then people will feel disenfranchised. They'll turn to violence, or they'll turn to some other means to get their views heard or to participate in democracy. I think the news can be a tremendously positive way of engaging people in a democracy, but it is obviously not doing it.
When we went to the break, I said we're going to bring in the ghost of Marshall McLuhan to ask, Is there something about the way that you watch television, about the way that things come through the television, ranging from the limited number of words? As someone has pointed out, if you took the whole 6 o'clock newscast and put it on a newspaper, it wouldn't fill the front page. Is there just no time to tell you anything? Do the waves shut your brain off? Is TV especially bad?
I'm going to give you a straight answer and then I'll have some fun with it. The straight answer is yes. Television is fundamentally different. When you're reading, your eye movements are different. The biomechanics of that process are different. When you're holding a newspaper, when you're reading a book, when you're watching television, you are in a different stance, a mental frame of mind. McLuhan also said that you are the screen. The dots on the television screen are projected on you. Now, having said that, I really like Marshall McLuhan, but he was very playful. He often used hot and cold interchangeably. He often contradicted himself in his own books, and I would really like to read some of his peer-reviewed academic articles before we talk about him again. I think there is something fundamentally different about television, and let me give you an anecdote about why I think that's true. I decided to find out more about the American Civil War one time. Just that was the topic I wanted to understand, didn't know much about it. I happened to listen to a series of academic lectures on audio tape from a Virginia Military Institute professor who knew military history. The number of donkeys that were owned in the North versus the South, the number of miles of railway, in enormous detail, and then military tactics on the battlefield. Then I said, great, I really like this topic. I'm going to go get the Ken Burns documentary on the Civil War, and I watched it, and I said, oh, now having been in television my whole life, having written and read the 6 o'clock news, I watched this and I said, oh, right, there's no content. I forgot. It was emotional, it was beautiful panning of still pictures, it was plaintive strains of a violin playing music. I felt viscerally involved in the Civil War, but there was no content. It was only emotion. So that's the difference in my view.
And it is odd, I mean, because McLuhan with his hot and cold, I agree that McLuhan can be a little hard to follow, but certainly if you had a camera on someone reading the newspaper or even listening to radio news, and then you had a camera on someone watching TV news, what would you get, you know? Animation on the one hand, zombie on the other. And this is worrisome.
But let me just say, though, as someone who occasionally teaches, I'm sure you'd agree with me, when you teach, you choose to use a bit of video because it shows very expensive things cheaply, shows dangerous things safely, shows remote things brought into the classroom. You can stop the action. You can show it over and over again. So I mean, video or visuals of any description, whether it's broadcast television or whether it's on YouTube or something, they have an enormous place in our education and in our human experience. But the problem is that television is so magnetic. You know, people predicted that the world was going to hell in a handbasket when newspapers were invented because they were going to distract people from the serious task of reading books. And if you go look at old newspapers, many of them have trivia in them. They said the same thing about radio, about television game shows, and we've been saying this for 150 years. The problem with television is it's so magnetic, quite unlike a book or quite unlike a magazine, newspaper, and so on. It is on in the home, it is pervasive, people can't talk to each other when it's on. How many times have we all done this to our loved ones? Shh, you know, the TV's on. And what's on the TV? Nothing. It's compelling. John Cameron Swayze's newscasts were 15 minutes long, as I recall. And people like him and Walter Cronkite, whom you quoted, not by name, but he set his newscast in type and it didn't fill the front page of a newspaper. They argued for another 15 minutes. They wanted a half-hour news. We have to have the time to tell these stories in greater depth, etc. Well, what happened when we got a half-hour news? Out came Charles Kuralt, On the Road, the features, the ballet dancers, you know, and arts and culture are important, but out came things that were not the news of the day. They were the features. Now, thoughtful people are arguing for a full hour of news. I haven't heard too many people doing that lately, but Walter Cronkite was. I think there's something called news inflation. I think you may well be able to tell the story of the news of the day in 15 minutes if you don't succumb to switching live to Budapest just because you have that satellite capability. When satellites first went up, the first report from Europe was from David Brinkley, and Huntley, I think, said, we're now going to switch live to Europe, you know, big buildup. And David Brinkley's in Europe. David, what's your report? And David Brinkley, in his inimitable style, said, there's nothing to report from Europe tonight. And commentators like us said, what on earth are we ever going to use these satellites for? What are people going to say to each other? So I'm not sure we have the constraints in the news that people complain about. I think we have a constraint of ideas and a constraint of will and a constraint of desire to tell the story of the day.
But I wonder how much of this is a limitation that's specific to TV, because I was thinking about your Civil War story, and you're listening on audio tape, and if you go, hey, what was that? You could stop it, rewind it, play it again. Evening news, it's here, it's gone. And therefore, only the sorts of things that appeal to people who don't mind that it's here and it's gone are really going to make the news, because it's not for the people who like to look back at what was on the previous page.
Unless you can attach it somehow to something really licentious and scandalous. And then, instead of having it gone, which means tomorrow you've got to produce afresh, it's good for several days. So you've got an item that you can do for free tomorrow. Just keep it going.
Well, I tell my clients in media training, look, if you feel aggrieved by reporters, I want to relax you. Everything you read, hear, and see in the news media is 100% accurate, with the exception of any story you have personal knowledge of. So behind the joke is the idea that radio and newspapers are not off the hook. What you do in the regions of this country, and even at the networks in this country, is you read the major newspapers, and that helps you decide what you're going to put on your radio or your TV program, and I don't care what they say, that still happens. And you find out when you burrow into the even the major national newspapers that a lot of stuff is inaccurate there. A lot of stuff is cliche-ridden and is regional-driven there. So I don't think they're off the hook at all.
I think YouTube is turning out to be perhaps a relatively unedited and uncontrolled user-sponsored news system. Where somebody can actually say, look, something's happening with me right now or around me that I can see. I take some pictures of it. I can somehow get them up there for other people to have access to. I don't think it's completely unfiltered, and I don't think it's completely unstructured, but I think most of the stuff that gets up there is, in fact, coming from the audience. So that would be a radically different way to go with news, because right now, of course, the whole thing is constructed by professionals who structure the event.
Okay, so let's lay a problem on top of that solution, too, because almost every solution generates another couple of problems. We don't have a shared experience in this country, in this culture, in this continent, or even in the English-speaking world. There was a time when 80 million Americans watched Milton Berle every Saturday night. 65 million Americans watched the evening news. But this is your program here tonight. 65 million people used to watch it. The ratings are plummeting. They're down to 20, 25 million people. And that's a lot of people. And they're still very influential, but we don't have a shared experience. If my friend over here is a right-wing wacko, he can go to a certain network and he can get his kind of views fed back to him. If someone is a left-wing person, they can go somewhere and get their views fed back to them. And the thing that I really worry about is not, as I'm worried about the quality of news, which is the topic of your program today, but I'm worried about the fragmentation. People going where they want to go to hear what they want to hear, and we are not having a shared experience.
Now that we've talked about some of the limitations, some of the problems, some of the disturbing trends, the infotainment and so on, suppose a major network hired you and said, everything we heard in the first part of the show has convinced us we've got to do something. We think you're the guy to do it. What does your 6 o'clock news look like? What's in it?
Let me give you two very quick caveats before I give you a direct answer. One, would this network be public or privately owned? That is going to be a huge determinant about what I can do. Secondly, if we were all running the 6 o'clock news as we are right now and looking at a worm poll, a simultaneous, real-time evaluation of how many viewers are watching this, and we switched away to some of the serious stuff we're advocating, we saw viewership plummet, and we switched back to Paris Hilton and we see it go up through the roof, we got a real dilemma. We may produce a tremendously good program that nobody wants to watch, but you asked a question, so I'm going to give you an answer. I would take my journalists and go back to a U.S. Commission on Freedom of the Press after World War II that said news should be defined news should define fact as fact and opinion as opinion. It should be full access to the day's intelligence. It should be a truthful, comprehensive, and intelligent account of the day's events in a context which gives them meaning. And every one of those phrases is enormously important for our democracy, and news falls down on the job most of the time. Here's what I'd get rid of. the misguided egalitarian streeter. The idea of interviewing rustic characters in the nooks and crannies of this country and or flying them in at great expense to a studio to do a town hall meeting and interview them about what they think about something they know nothing about, that is a waste of time and money. I would get rid of the fixation with polls and focus groups. The fact that 37% of the population doesn't like you 42% of the time, most Thursdays, is irrelevant. It is not news. It is a push-pull. It's something that you can drag out of the population if you need to. I would have a serious discussion on a daily basis, as I did in campus radio where I started. Are we supposed to give people what they need to know, or is it what they want to know? Do we give them a bit of what they want to know so that they'll listen to what they need to know? Is it we who decide what they need to know? That's a tough debate to have when you're an editor or a journalist, and that debate should happen every day. You need a bit of local control, and finally, just what came to mind during the commercial, you have to stop the wire service every now and then and say, wait a minute now, what is important here? We're covering the environment every day, but you know, there's an institute out in San Francisco that says 100 species of insects go extinct every year, and scientists are really worried about the lack of diversity in the gene pool. But that's not going to make the news, because you can't take a picture of a bug, not a very nice looking bug either. Talk about the anchors having to be good looking, the news has to be good looking too. You cannot just make that news arbitrarily. But that's exactly what news organizations should be doing. They should say, hold on a minute, we have an obligation to get this on the public discussion, whether people like it or not. So those are, I think, that'd be a start.
Dan Rather one time, talking about stem cells, said, well, you know, this is kind of complicated. If you really want to understand this, you know, when I'm done, go read a newspaper. But I wonder, should the 6 o'clock news try and incorporate that? Should there be a website, that says, if you want more on Afghanistan, go to our website's background on Afghanistan? Or should they simply serve the people who want entertainment with the extra benefit of feeling as though you've been following the news when you haven't, though you know you should, and let the rest of us go somewhere else?
Every medium is trying to become another medium or swallow up another medium right now. TV newscasts are trying to become web pages by saying go online for more. Newspapers are doing the same thing. It really does have tremendous potential to do what both of us are talking about simultaneously. So people who are interested in this can go on alanbonner.com and hear other views and hear about what we talked about during the commercial break.
Any views expressed here are not necessarily those of the Mackenzie Institute, its speakers, sponsors, or supporters. But the Institute is dedicated to fostering public discussion, debate, and education about security matters. Google the Mackenzie Institute to join the discussion. The Mackenzie Institute is grateful to its sponsors and supporters. Some of our short pods and long talks are a result of the support of Heathbridge Capital Management Limited, the National Post, and Dundurn Publishing.